When they asked me for the favor, I didn't hesitate. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the favor itself, not even what it turned into, just the speed of my answer. There was no pause where I weighed it, no moment where I asked myself if this was a good idea, no instinctive warning that something might follow. I said yes the way people say yes to things that feel too small to matter, casually, automatically, almost politely. At the time, I didn't even register it as a decision. It felt more like a reflex. I remember where I was when they asked, not because the place was important, but because it was ordinary. Nothing in my surroundings suggested that something meaningful was happening. The day had already settled into its usual rhythm, the kind of rhythm where you've stopped paying attention to the details. They didn't ask in a serious tone. They didn't explain much. They didn't make it emotional. They asked the way people ask when they've already decided what your answer will be. And I gave it to them. I remember thinking that this would take a few minutes, that it would fit neatly into the edges of my day, that once it was done, it would disappear completely. That belief felt solid. It didn't feel like optimism, it felt like common sense. At no point did I think this could change something. I thought, this will be over quickly. Looking back now, that confidence feels strange. Not because I was careless, but because I didn't understand how often life changes quietly. No warnings, no buildup. Just a moment that feels too small to notice while it's happening. That's what this was. A moment so ordinary that I didn't bother to remember it properly. And yet, it stayed. Back then, I had a reputation I didn't know I had. I was the person people reached out to when they needed something handled without friction. Not because I was especially generous, not because I was dependable in a heroic way, but because I didn't resist. I answered messages quickly. I adjusted my schedule when plans shifted. I filled gaps without asking why they existed. It wasn't something I trained myself to do. It was something I slid into slowly. Over time, it became easier to say yes than to pause. Saying yes ended conversations cleanly. Saying no stretched them out. No came with questions. Yes came with relief. And I liked the relief. It felt good to be easy to deal with. It felt good not to complicate things. It felt good to be the person who didn't require explanations. So when they asked me for the favor, my mind didn't treat it as a request. It treated it as confirmation. Confirmation that I was still that person, the one who could be counted on, the one who wouldn't make things harder. They used the word small when they described it. They didn't emphasize it. They didn't repeat it. They just said it once, casually. And that was enough. That word did a lot of work. It shaped the entire request before I ever examined it. Small favors don't require planning. Small favors don't need boundaries. Small favors don't come with consequences. At least, that's what we tell ourselves. I didn't ask what would happen afterward. I didn't ask who else might be affected. I didn't ask what my role would look like if things didn't go smoothly. Those questions never formed. Not because I avoided them, but because the situation didn't invite them. Everything about the request was framed to feel temporary, contained, safe. I remember thinking that even if it became inconvenient, it wouldn't matter. That inconvenience was a reasonable price for being helpful. What I didn't understand then was how quickly inconvenience can turn into obligation, how easily presence becomes participation, how quietly expectations grow when you don't interrupt them early. At that point, though, none of that felt real. All I felt was the comfort of familiarity, the comfort of being needed in a way that didn't demand too much, the comfort of agreeing without friction. And once I agreed,
everything began to rearrange itself around that yes. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly enough that I didn't notice the shift until I was already standing inside it.
The shift didn't announce itself. There was no clear moment where I thought, this is getting out of hand. It happened quietly, through other people. Someone else referenced a favor in a conversation I wasn't part of. Not casually, not vaguely, specifically, as if my involvement had been understood more deeply than I remembered agreeing to. At first, I assumed it was a misunderstanding. That happens all the time. People hear things differently. They remember conversations in ways that favor their expectations. I told myself I would clarify it later, but later didn't arrive cleanly. Instead, another person brought it up. Then another. Each time the story grew slightly. Not exaggerated, just expanded. What had been described as temporary began to sound ongoing. What had been framed as minor began to sound necessary. I started noticing how people spoke around me, not to me, around me, as if my role had already been defined. That was the moment I realized something important. Small favors don't stay small once other people begin depending on them. Dependence changes the shape of responsibility. It turns presence into participation, participation into expectation, and expectation is hard to walk away from without explanation. I remember lying awake that night, replaying the original request, trying to find the point where I had misunderstood it, the sentence I had missed, the condition I had overlooked. I couldn't find one, because the words hadn't changed, only the meaning had. And meaning has a way of shifting without asking permission. The next day, I noticed myself hesitating before responding to messages. That was new. I reread things more carefully. I paused before agreeing to plans. Not because I was angry, not because I felt taken advantage of, but because I felt something heavier settling into place. Awareness. I was beginning to understand that what I had offered wasn't just help, it was availability. And availability, once noticed, is rarely left unused. The favor didn't look like much when it finally happened. That's important to say. There was no dramatic setup, no tension in the air, no moment where anyone hesitated long enough for it to feel serious. If you were watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. It felt like an errand, something routine, something that fit neatly into the category of things people do for each other without thinking twice. I remember telling myself that this was exactly what I had expected, that there was nothing hidden inside it. I showed up where they asked me to be, I listened to what they needed, I followed instructions that were clear and uncomplicated. There was no rush. That absence of urgency made everything feel safer. Urgency forces you to pay attention. Calm convinces you that you don't need to. As I was doing what they asked, I noticed a few moments of discomfort. Not enough to stop, not enough to question the situation openly, just small signals. A pause that lasted a little longer than necessary. A detail that didn't quite line up with the way it had been explained. A glance exchanged between people that didn't include me. Each one was easy to ignore on its own. Together, they formed something I didn't know how to name yet. I told myself that discomfort didn't automatically mean something was wrong, that unfamiliar situations always feel slightly off at first. I told myself I was overthinking it. That thought came easily to me back then. It always had. So I stayed present. I stayed helpful. I stayed focused on finishing what I had agreed to do. The favor required my presence more than my effort. That was another thing that made it feel harmless. I wasn't creating anything. I wasn't changing anything. I was just there. At least that's how it felt at the time. When it was over, there was a brief sense of completion. Not satisfaction, just relief. I remember thinking, that's it. I expected the night to reset after that,
to return to its earlier shape, but it didn't. Instead, it stretched, and that stretch created space for something else to move in.
There was a moment where I could have corrected it. Not dramatically, not with confrontation, just a sentence, a simple clarification. Something like, "That's not what I agreed to," or "I can't keep doing this." I remember exactly when that moment appeared. It wasn't during a heated conversation. It wasn't when anyone was upset. It was during something ordinary, a casual exchange, a few people standing around, talking about what would happen next. They spoke as if my role was already decided. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just assumed. That assumption hung in the air longer than it should have. I felt it land on me. This was the opening. I could have stepped into it and changed the shape of the situation. Instead, I stayed quiet. At the time, that felt like the polite thing to do. Interrupting felt unnecessary. Correcting them felt awkward. I told myself that bringing it up right then would make things uncomfortable for everyone. That thought mattered more to me than it should have. I didn't want to be the person who complicated things. I didn't want to slow the momentum down. So I let the conversation move forward without me in it. That silence was interpreted as agreement. I didn't realize how fast that happens. Silence doesn't stay neutral for long. People fill it with whatever makes sense to them. And what made sense to them was that I was on board. I noticed the shift after that. Not immediately, but gradually. The way requests were phrased differently. The way explanations became shorter. The way my presence was taken into account before decisions were made. I hadn't said yes again, but I hadn't said no either. And in that space, expectations grew. I remember thinking that I could still fix it later, that this was just a temporary misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't stay temporary once people start relying on them.
By the time I fully understood what was happening, leaving no longer felt simple. It wasn't because anyone was forcing me to stay. No one threatened me, no one pressured me openly. It was more subtle than that. I had become part of the rhythm. Things were planned with me in mind. My availability was assumed. My involvement was built into the structure of what was happening. Removing myself would have required explanations, not angry ones, disappointed ones. And disappointment carries its own kind of weight. I told myself that staying a little longer would be easier than stepping away abruptly. That thought felt reasonable. After all, nothing bad was happening. No one was being hurt. No rules were being broken. The cost was invisible, and invisible costs are the hardest ones to notice. I began to adjust around it. I shifted my schedule, I delayed other plans, I responded more carefully to messages. Each adjustment felt small on its own. Together, they reshaped my days. I noticed how tired I felt afterward. Not physically, mentally, like I was carrying something that required constant attention. I stopped talking about it with people outside the situation, not because it was secret, but because I didn't know how to explain why I was still involved. Explaining would have forced me to confront it, so I avoided that. Avoidance became another form of staying. At some point, I realized I was waiting for a clear reason to leave. Something obvious, something undeniable. But those moments don't always arrive. Sometimes nothing goes wrong. Sometimes things just continue. And continuation can trap you as effectively as a crisis. By the time I admitted to myself that the favor had turned into an obligation, I was already inside it. Not stuck, but settled, and leaving would have meant admitting that I should have spoken sooner. That realization kept me quieter longer than anything else.
Nothing collapsed. That's what makes this harder to explain. There was no moment where everything clearly went wrong. No argument that forced a decision. No event that demanded an ending. Life simply adjusted around the favor, and I adjusted with it. I started measuring my time differently, not by what I wanted to do, but by what I needed to stay available for. Plans became tentative, evenings felt shorter. I caught myself checking messages more often, even when my phone hadn't buzzed. Anticipation settled in quietly, not anxiety, just awareness. I didn't feel trapped, I felt responsible. That distinction mattered to me at the time. Responsibility sounds reasonable, mature. It's a word that makes staying justified. But responsibility without choice slowly becomes something else. I noticed the cost in small ways, the way my attention drifted during conversations that had nothing to do with the favor, the way I felt relief when something was canceled, even if it had nothing to do with me. I became more tired than I should have been, not physically, mentally, like part of my mind was always standing slightly to the side, waiting for the next request, the next assumption, the next quiet expectation. I stopped feeling fully present anywhere else, and that was when I realized the favor hadn't taken my time. It had taken my margin, the space where nothing is required of you. That was didn't announce itself. It just stayed.
Eventually, the situation resolved itself. Not cleanly, not dramatically, just gradually. People moved on, needs changed, the structure that had formed around my involvement loosened. One day, without any announcement, I was no longer needed. That should have felt like relief, and it did, but it also left something behind: awareness. I realized how much of myself I had rearranged without noticing, how often I had chosen comfort over clarity, silence over correction, not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to disturb the calm. That calm came at a cost I hadn't calculated. Since then, I paused differently, not dramatically, not defensively, just long enough to hear myself think. I've learned that small is not a promise. It's a description that can change once other people step into it. I've learned that favors don't grow heavy because of malice. They grow heavy because of expectation, and expectation feeds on silence. I don't regret helping. That's important. What I regret is not speaking sooner, not because it would have changed the outcome, but because it would have kept the choice mine. Some lessons don't arrive with consequences you can point to. They arrive as adjustments you carry forward, quietly. These days, when someone asks me for something, I still listen. I still consider. But I don't answer as quickly. I don't confuse ease with safety anymore. And some nights after everyone sleeps, I think about how small that first yes felt, and how long it stayed with me.